Stroll Fox, welcome to On the Red Dot. In this episode of our series, Old School, we'll be taking a look at collectibles and their collectors to revisit what life was like during the good old days. At our first stop this week, we meet a group of young men who call themselves the Singapore Bus Spotters. It's 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning. At least once a month, Zachariah, Santosh and Mark can be found at bus terminals like this. They're bus enthusiasts, or also known as bus spotters.
Basically, what we do is we take note of the different kind of buses running around. We also take pictures of them, document them throughout the years that they are in service.
Besides taking photographs, I also collect some memorabilia like those service plates, those bus registration numbers, and etc.
Mark began the hobby when he was just 6 years old. Today, the 25-year-old who created the Facebook page Buses in Singapore is one of the biggest contributors to bus spotting in Singapore.
It helps to preserve a little part of the history of what makes Singapore, Singapore. It's very nostalgic to remember and see all the old photos that were posted online about those non-aircon buses.
At 15 years old, Santosh is one of the youngest bus spotters in Singapore.
It feels like I want to live during that period because nowadays with aircon buses, it doesn't really feel that nice. I prefer non-aircon buses. When it's not raining, you can feel the wind, or when it's raining, you get wet. You have stories to tell to other people.
To learn more about the history of buses, the bus spotters met up with Bobby Tay, a local history enthusiast. The 76-year-old likes to be known as the bus guy.
What has changed in the buses today?
Last time the windows not glass, all wood. So there was only one light. Even daytime very dark.
So, Uncle, how was buses like in the past?
Buses in those days were much smaller, and then short wheelbase, and no doors. It's always open. So sometimes if you miss the bus, you can run, you can jump up the bus. Yeah.
Today, the buses they take pictures of are mostly shiny and new. A far stretch from how buses used to be when Bobby was their age.
In those days, everything, the floorboards was all made of wood, and there were wooden strips. So if it's slightly wet, it can be slippery. When it's raining, I used to look in between the steps to look. I could see just the road, the water on the road.
In the 50s and 60s, a two-man crew operated most buses. The driver of the bus and a conductor who punched holes in your tickets and collected fares.
In a bus, there are two classes. The front section behind the driver is the first class. On the back portion, the seats are longer, so you can hold about 7 passengers or 10 passengers each side. But the seats are made of wood, whereas the first class is made of a rubber cushion, where it's a soft cushion.
Bobby started collecting bus tickets when he was just 10 years old. It was the next best alternative to collecting stamps, which he couldn't afford. He could get them for free, picking them up from the floors of buses.
It started off a collection, but then if I already have so much, then I started writing, and the more I know, the more I write. Because it's the history that makes up the collection. If you have the real objects, it'll be even better. So that's why, to me, the collection is just as important as the history itself.
The quality of buses improved with the times. By the 60s, aluminum replaced wooden components. And the sound of rattling metal became synonymous with the early years of the decade. The first double-decker buses went into service in Singapore in June 1977, marking a big step towards solving Singapore's traffic problems.
60s, 70s, the buses got more organized. There were no more duplication of routes, so things became more streamlined and more pleasant for the commuters.
Today, the boys still enjoy taking joyrides on the new buses, taking notes on the way. They know that a bus today will become a distant memory tomorrow. Between memorizing bus routes and spotting buses with his friends, Zachariah has his own treasure of memories to go home to.
Hi, this is my room collections. So basically, this is all the collections that I've collected in the years of being a bus enthusiast. This is my digital display system. So basically, this is called EDS, Electronic Display System. This is how it will scroll to a different route. It's actually the counter whereby
Zachariah holds a diploma in aerospace avionics from Republic Polytechnic, and he's put his engineering knowledge to good use, creating this setup single-handedly.
This is my oldest collection. So basically, it's I obtained from a scrapyard. So when I asked the uncle, he said it's from a bus from the 1960s. So I said, well, it's a must-have to collect this item. This badging was from the STC bus, those old Nissan diesel non-aircon buses.
Late 60s, 70s, actually we have lots of buses in Singapore, you know. We have the Hockley bus, we have the STC, we have the Taiko Yard, you know. So when I was explaining to him, you know, you can see that his eyes, you know, open up, you know.
Zachariah, who's 23 years old, has been enamored by the beauty of buses and terminals since he was 7. He wishes he could turn back time a decade or two to experience what buses were like then.
In those days when you boarded the bus during the 60s, it was very nostalgic, where you had the community spirit. Let's say when it rains, everybody will actually help out each other to close the window.
Strangers to the hobby of bus spotting may find Zachariah's collection unusual, but visitors will always walk away with a sense of nostalgia.
As a child, you like to sit at the front of the bus, at the upper deck. So there was some overgrown trees nearly touching the double deck. So when the branch hit the bus, right, I shout. So then the tree branch goes to another seat. So then that kid also shouted, Then the last kid also shouted, So it's like some sort of like Kalang Raw or something like that in the bus, which now you won't even experience it. There's no more non-aircon bus.
I want to get a bus where I still can find bus tickets, but I can't find bus tickets. I'm very frustrated. When you tap the bus, you don't get any tickets. That's the trouble. You know what I mean? It reminds us of the past, how simple life was, and then how, you know, how carefree everything was in those days. Things were cheap, and then life was so simple that it's almost very quiet. It's that when you record the memories and you have things to show, you'll never forget it.
Coming up after the break, we continue our ride into the past as we take a look at a different mode of transport. Stay tuned. Bicycles. They've been around since the late 18th century. But what about bicycles in Singapore? We find out how the simple ride has touched the lives of some Singaporeans through the time.
Bikes looks much better. They are more beautiful than the newer one. They are so simple, their line work are so simple.
To the uninformed, Kungju's collection may look like an ordinary bicycle shop, but each piece contains a unique piece of history.
The history is very, very important. You don't just anyhow buy a bike and then you build it. There must be something behind it. There is a story that you can tell.
Aju, as he's known to many of his friends, grew up living in his father's car workshop. He's the youngest in a family of 12 siblings.
In the shop, I was practicing how to spray, sanding, using all kind of materials when I was a young boy. So, and I used to see my elder brother, he used to paint cartoons, the Mad World, I still can remember. And yeah, I used to follow him, and yeah, he inspired me a lot on art itself.
However, when his elder brother Anthony passed away in 2006, Arju found himself lost. But his passion was renewed again 6 years ago.
I saw a bicycle passing me, and I got the thought of trying one and see how it works to fill up my spare time. And from that time onwards, it has been growing. Today, I think I got maybe 100 or more.
The first bicycles in Singapore were believed to have emerged around the same time as the trishaws in the 1920s. Popularity of the bicycle grew with the times. By 1960, Singapore had 268,000 bicycles compared to 63,000 cars and 19,000 motorcycles. 53-year-old Jason Song, who grew up during this heyday of bicycles, remembers these times vividly.
At that time, we were quite small size. I was quite small. Of course, when we hopped onto the bike, we couldn't stop the bike. And the first thrill was nice, but the end was a fall.
There was once a day that I would pray for you. I'd go and misbehave just so you'd notice too. Sneaking looks up and down from across the room. And damn, what a hell of a view. I feel good, you look great, I like you, I can't wait. A first time, a first date. You're so fine, I'm so late. You sip wine, I drink straight. Don't waste time to my place. I feel my heart erase. So catch me if I fall.
Steel racing bike. $5 for the registration. And you cannot collect the bike immediately. You need to collect it the second day. You see? So that was my first racing bike, and it's made of steel. That's where Arju comes in, that he brought life back to steel bike.
The steel bikes are very much different from the carbon. Steel, they have soul in it. Carbon actually have lifespan. So steel is forever. After maybe 100 years, well, the bike still, you can build them up again.
What Arju does might seem simple to many, but repainting and building each bicycle draws from over 40 years of his experience in building cars.
This is actually an English bike. It's backdated it's in the late 50s. The gearing is very beautiful. It's like a shifter. We can see this shifter in the old vintage cars. This bicycle, if you want to ride, you need some technique. It's not like now the modern bikes that we are shifting.
Out of over 100 bicycles in his collection, Arju has sold about 20 bikes to various collectors, each costing from $3,000 to $10,000. Today, Arju rarely considers selling any of his bicycles.
It's just a piece of art. It's just a canvas and some paint. And how do you say how much is a piece of art?
Arju's wife, Katie, runs the workshop alongside him, working on administrative matters at a desk as age and illness has made her less mobile. They've known each other for almost 40 years.
I have a wonderful wife. She actually supported me on what I'm doing.
But Arju's passion for pricey old-school bicycles can sometimes get to her.
angry, but okay lah. I said okay. Then he said, because it's a passion, he just do and do it. He said he know what is he buying, what is he doing, because he don't know the payment. I'm the one who do the payment. So then he only how to go and buy only. Yeah.
Time will not stand still for anyone, but a visit to Arju's collection gives visitors a chance to revisit fond memories.
They bring back their memories. When some of them, when they are young, they are poor and they can't afford to buy one of their favorite bikes. And I think when they come and visit me, they can find one that is missing in their life. So I think that's why they make them smile when they look at it and remember their old days.
We hope you've enjoyed this ride into the past. Coming up after the break, we meet a young man who took a leaf out of his father's book to continue his passion for comics. The heyday of comic books in Singapore was in the late 80s to the 90s. But in this segment, we'll meet a few individuals who take us further back in time to revisit the charm of old-school comics. Times like this have become a rare occasion for Eddie Yap. But when the 67-year-old starts flipping through his collection of vintage comics, he usually finds himself immersed in memories of yesteryear.
Nowadays, yes, you know, we have modern comics, the drawings, everything is all so good and immaculate. But somehow there's just something of this old school thing that has a magic in them.
Comics came into Eddie's life when he was just 6 years old in the early 1950s. They were his father's way of giving the youngest of his 4 children a special treat.
He would bring us to Rex Theatre, and usually on a Saturday night, and the 9:30 p.m. show. And just before the show starts, we will always go to a mama shop just beside Rex Theatre, and that guy sells all the comics there.
Caricature and cartoons were a feature of local newspapers as early as the late 40s. They were typically socio-political in nature, using humor to comment on the issue of the day. By the 80s, comics became a tool for storytelling. For Eddie, comics is a way for him to strengthen connections.
Kids nowadays can just zip everywhere, you know, to find out about things. But the bond between the father and the son, you know, if you have something, you know, like comics, you know, you can still relate to them. And there's a bond there, you see.
Eddie's son, Brighton Yap, was introduced to comics when his father's collection was discovered as they were moving house in 1980.
Back then, most of us were playing video games, you know, but what I experienced from the comics was a little bit different because I could see how, you know, in the 1960s, the art and how people were living their lives back then. I didn't know how my parents lived during that time, you know, what they did for entertainment. So that was my way of connecting with them.
Brighton has built on his father's collection, tracking down missing issues while discovering old-school marvels. Today, he has a collection of about 10,000 comics that's worth around 78,000 Singapore dollars. For Brighton, the money spent on vintage comics is well worth it.
We like to preserve what we used to enjoy and what we don't have anymore, because the simplicity of life back then was different. We didn't have television, we didn't have computers, so that's what got me started also.
Before the 80s, local cartoonists did not create story-based comics. Their works were usually drawn on a single frame or a 4-panel comic template. For a greater variety, Bill Teo turned to comics imported from overseas.
They were so limited in activity. That's why I say I started reading Beano, Dandy, and Desperate Dan from Britain. And because there were not enough comics to go around, if I miss one issue, I have to really desperately run to the next store, you know, and hope he has. Because at that time, all these stores, so I think at the most, they brought in or two pieces of that comic. And they spoil the comics because the first thing they do is stamp their company stamp on the comic.
The popularity of comics in Singapore surged in the late 80s. In 1986, Comics 880 was founded. Besides being the pioneer comics publication in Singapore, they were also the first to use comic art to tell stories. Bill opened his comic book shop during this period and found great success. But still, comic reading was a rare sight in public.
They probably buy home and read. But in Japan, it's a different story. In Japan, 90+% of people read comics. So everywhere you see somebody holding a manga.
From the late 80s to the 90s, many began speculating on the future value of comics.
I warned them, it's not a game to play with, because the bubble will burst, and eventually burst. And so those fellows who had collected multiple copies found themselves practically their savings gone because the value dropped. And that kind of thing killed the industry a bit.
Comics were once a simple pastime for Eddie. But today, those vintage books can still spring a few surprises.
They were drawing things where, things that we could only imagine, our smartphones, touch screens, everything. Back then, we could only imagine. But right now, it's a reality. So I think that's quite awesome.
I hope you enjoyed reminiscing about the past with our collectors. I shall catch you again next week. But in the meantime, if you'd like to relive this episode or any of our previous week's shows, you can head over to these websites and you'll be able to watch it online. And for a whole lot more on what happens behind the scenes and for what you can expect next week, be sure to check out our Facebook page. I'm Cheryl Fox. Till we meet again next week, take care.